Moab for a little bit. So he's going to be on the run for several chapters. So we'll probably kind of speed up a little bit, try to do some catch up and get ahead, so we have plenty of time to continue into 2 Samuel as the term continues. We just finished up in chapter 19 with that interesting phrase again, is Saul among the prophets. So Saul is chasing David all the way to wherever Samuel's at in Ramah. And you have that interesting story. All of Saul's servants are coming, and they end up prophesying. And then Saul himself, once again, the Spirit of God comes on him, and even he removes his clothes, is in a kind of a humbled state. Kind of an interesting comparison to Jonathan, who we're going to see pop up here again. If you remember, Jonathan, a couple chapters earlier, purposefully removed his cloak and tunic and gave it to David, just as a sign of their covenant together, as a sign of their friendship, and I think really as a sign of, you are going to be, you are the future, you are the king, and not me. And here we have the opposite. Saul it almost seems like this kind of this mad state where he's not quite in control of himself, because if he was in full capacity if his capacities were full right now, he probably wouldn't be praising and prophesying in this same way. And that's why they use this saying again, as Saul also among the prophets. So we've been seeing the deterioration of Saul really since almost the beginning, but it kind of got started in chapter 15 with him not be willing to destroy and kill all the Amalekites. If you remember, he kept Agag and some of the best. He blamed it on the people, or he made excuses, but he kept some of that back. He was not willing to destroy everything, and that's going to be an interesting comparison to later on this evening as we get to the priests at Nob. So we're here in chapter 20. Jonathan is going to meet up with David here. David fled from Naioth and Ramah, and he comes to Jonathan where they met there. And it's kind of interesting. I just wonder. We get a lot of story in this book, but you just wonder kind of some of the mindset, what they're thinking, what they're you don't quite get every part of the conversation. You definitely get David's just angst and his, not necessarily his fear, but just his frustration with this whole situation. It says in verse 1, what have I done? What did I do wrong? How have I sinned against your father so that he wants to take my life? Is he wrong in those in those feelings? I mean, Jonathan's been saying it. We've seen. I mean, there's no logical reason for Saul to want to kill David in this way. I mean, he really is. He's really no threat. David isn't wanting to have him killed or depose him in any way, even though he knows he's going to be the next king. That's God's doing. He's doing God's will, but he's no threat against Saul. And you get the sense that Jonathan still, maybe he doesn't have the full picture. Of course, he's not at every interaction with David and Saul. You get the sense that maybe he doesn't want to believe that Saul's as bad as he is. Verse 2 there on that second paragraph. No, you won't die. Listen, my father doesn't do anything great or small without telling me. So why would he hide this matter from me? This can't be true. So Jonathan is, saying like, I know my dad. I'm in his inner circle. Everything he says, I know about. Kind of seems a little naive. At this point, I'd be surprised if Saul has no idea about Jonathan and David's friendship, and maybe even knows about the covenant that they have taken together. So I kind of wonder if Jonathan thinks he knows everything, and Saul knows he thinks that and keeps things from him in a way. David, I think, kind of sees through that. He says in verse 3, your father certainly knows that I have found favor with you. He has said, Jonathan must not know of this, or else he will be grieved. David also swore, as surely as the Lord lives and as yourself live, there is but a step between me and death. So he's, I wouldn't say quite an argument here, but definitely I think David doesn't kind of sees the fuller picture, whereas Jonathan might not. And Jonathan just says, "Fine, whatever you say, whatever you want, whatever I can do to fix this situation." I think he's just trying to be a mediator, trying to just bring the two back together. Remember, they're family at this point. David is married to Michal, Jonathan's sister. They're brother-in-laws, and David is a son-in-law to Saul. So they are family. So David comes up with this kind of scheme to figure out Saul's mindset, and basically just he's going to miss this new moon ceremony. Think of it kind of like a Sabbath. At the beginning of each month, they would have kind of a feast or celebration, just celebrating the new moon. So it seems like the king would have all of his people together for a sometimes it can be a 2 or 3 day feast. So he is going to he's basically going to miss the ceremony and see what Saul says. If he doesn't mind, if he doesn't care, if he's not offended by it, then maybe he's not quite as mad. But if he gets mad at David, then that's going to kind of clue himself in on whether or not David is safe or not. Skipping down to verse 9, "No," Jonathan responds, "if I ever find out my father has evil intentions against you, wouldn't I tell you?" So David asked Jonathan, "Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly?" We might come back to that about the new moon. If you have any questions, definitely stop me there. We'll come back to that in a little bit, hopefully. He answers in verse 11, "Come on, let's go out to the countryside." So both of them went out to the countryside. "By the Lord, the God of Israel, I will sound out my father by this time tomorrow or the next day. If I find out that he is favorable toward you, will I not send for you and tell you? If my father intends to bring evil on you, may the Lord punish Jonathan and do so severely if I do not tell you and send you away so you may leave safely. May the Lord be with you just as he was with my father. If I continue to live, show me kindness with the Lord. But if I die, don't ever withdraw your kindness from my household, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of David's enemies from the face of this earth." So Jonathan is agreeing to kind of this plan, and he promises, if I figure out that Saul really does intend to kill you, then I'm going to tell you. I swear by it. I promise to tell you the truth. And that's, again, I think Jonathan still can't believe. Remember, Saul made an oath that he would not kill David. So he's thinking that Saul's going to keep that oath. He's not going to kill David. Well, we know that Saul has tried to kill him already, and he's going to go back on that oath here. But this verse 14 is kind of interesting. "But if I die," and then verse 15, "don't ever withdraw your kindness from my household, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." What's Jonathan asking for? What's he saying there? Remember me when you are the one in power, basically. Jonathan, I think even more clearly here, knows what the future holds for David. And he also knows what typically happens when a ruling family is replaced by another ruling family. Usually, and we'll see that even in the biblical narrative, once we get to the kings of Israel, about every generation or so, maybe a king will have a son, and that son becomes king, but it doesn't last very long. Someone comes along, assassinates the king, and then his family becomes ruling family. And then someone comes along and assassinates that next king and kills off all of the possible heirs, and that family becomes the ruling family. So you typically, when you change from one family to another, that usually is bad for the preceding family that That was part of the rulership before. They usually don't make it. So Jonathan understands this, and he's making sure David promises to show kindness to him. And it's interesting, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So he understands that this is more about the Lord doing all this than even David, and who has already declared David an enemy at this point. Saul. He said that specifically, that David was an enemy to him. So Jonathan, he doesn't probably know that fact, but it's a little bit of foretelling that the Lord is going to cut off all of David's enemies, even Saul himself. Then Jonathan made a covenant, verse 18, with the house of David. And this isn't just David, this is a covenant with the family going forward. David, what would happen if he just made this covenant with David, and then after David's gone and his son Solomon, well, his son Solomon could do whatever to Saul's family and, wouldn't be part of that. So he makes that covenant with the house of David. May the Lord hold David's enemies accountable. Jonathan once again swore to David in his love for him because he loved him as he loved himself. The reason behind all of these covenants and this dialogue is clearly Jonathan's love for David. He told him, I'll do whatever you want. I'm going to try to be a mediator. I'm going to try to reconcile you and Saul, but if I find anything out about the evil that my father intends to bring to you, I'm going to tell you because of his love for him. So they kind of discuss. Since it happens a couple times, I kind of breeze through this discussion. We've heard this story before. This whole plan of if I find out that Saul wants to kill you, I'm going to shoot the arrows off into the field. And if I say go farther, go look for the arrows farther, then that means kind of get out of town. If I say they're closer, then there's no problem. It's safe to come back. Jonathan's got this plan. So David, right at the very end, verse 24, David hid in the countryside. And then at the new moon, the king sat down to eat the meal. He sat at his usual place on the seat by the wall, Jonathan facing him, and Abner took his place beside Saul. But David's place was empty. So that's the point, where we've got this normal party. Typically, again, it's at the beginning of each month when there's a new moon. David's place, the whole court should be there, but David's place was empty. Saul did not say anything that day because he thought something unexpected has happened. He must be ceremonially unclean. Yes, that's it. He's unclean. So he makes an excuse for him. He says, okay, he missed the first day. Nothing suspicious about that. There's a lot of reasons why someone would miss that first day, and he gives one. But day number 2, however, the day after the new moon, the second day, David's place was still empty. So he starts to ask questions. And it's interesting, we've started to see this more, Saul referring to David, not as David, but as Jesse's son. And I get the sense, actually, we didn't even discuss this. Does anyone know what the word David actually means? Beloved one. So it's kind of interesting. He doesn't want to use David's name. I don't know if it's because of that meaning. It'd be tough to say, I want to kill the beloved one. But he doesn't want to use his name, so he uses Jesse's son instead. I think of, if I'm mad at Annabelle, I'm not going to call her Annabelle. I'm going to say, that's Melanie's daughter right there. I'm going to disassociate myself with her in that instance. That's kind of the idea I got with that one. He doesn't want to call him his name. He definitely doesn't want to call him his son-in-law. Where is my son-in-law David? He wants to, verbally distance himself from David some more. Why didn't Jesse's son come to the meal either yesterday or today? He knows Jonathan probably knows the answer, so he's going to ask him. Jonathan said, David asked for my permission to go to Bethlehem. He said, please let me go because our clan is holding a sacrifice in the town and my brother has told me to be there. So now if I found favor with you, let me go so I can see my brothers. That's why he didn't come to the king's table. Let's see if Saul picks up on this. Verse 30, Saul became angry with Jonathan and uses probably the coolest phrase, I guess. I got to start using this phrase. You son of a perverse and rebellious woman. If I'm mad at someone, I'm going to start calling you that. You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you are siding with Jesse's son to your own shame and to the disgrace of your mother? What's Saul saying with that phrase? You're no son of mine. Yeah, exactly. I mean, perverse and rebellious woman, or he's discrediting himself from removing himself from his relationship with Jonathan now because of Jonathan kind of sticking up for David. He knows he's siding with Jesse's son there again, to your own shame, to the disgrace of your mother. Every day Jesse's son lives on earth, you and your kingship are not secure. There's the reason for all this. He knows. I think he knows at this point that David's probably destined to replace Saul and replace his family, and he doesn't want that to happen, obviously. But he knows that otherwise, if without David, then Jonathan would be the king. So now send for him and bring him to me. He must die. Jonathan answered his father back, why is he to be killed? What has he done? And verse 33, so he doesn't like David because David is going to, he's afraid that David will replace Jonathan, his son, as king. So what does Saul do? He throws a spear and tries to kill Jonathan. You can see just the mental craziness just going on with Saul, and we've seen the progression. I don't think Saul is a crazy man at all. I don't think he's mentally ill in any way, but you see what happens when sin and these ideas and paranoia and all these things are just allowed to fester and grow over the years. You become like a crazy man. You're willing to throw a spear at people that you love, people that your own son. And I like that. Jonathan, so he knew that his father was determined to kill David. Well, no duh. Yeah, if he's going to kill me, he's probably willing to kill David at this point. So Jonathan finally, I think, has whatever wool was in front of his eyes is gone now. He gets up from the table, fiercely angry, did not eat any food that second day of the new moon, and was grieved because of his father's shameful behavior toward David. I'm reminded of when Samuel left Saul and didn't see him again. He would mourn for him. He was grieved because of the way Saul is acting and the way he was, his shameful behavior toward David. So now Jonathan is feeling that same way. I mean, Jonathan, I think he loves his father. I mean, it's his father. There's care there, just like Samuel loved Saul, and to see Saul just give in to all these things and see his behavior in this way is sad for him. The next morning, don't forget, David is sitting. He's not actually in Bethlehem. He's actually sitting close by, waiting for Jonathan's message. So he has the young servant with them, and he shoots some arrows. He sends that servant, and the phrase there to show that David is not safe. The arrow is beyond you, isn't it? Hurry up and don't stop. Just as a way to say, hey, it's best that you get out of here. Jonathan sends the servant boy in, and he risks at least one more face-to-face meeting with David. David got up from the south side of the stone, fell face down to the ground, and paid homage 3 times. Then Jonathan kissed each other and wept with each other, though David wept more. They see this as, at least for the years up until this point, David might have been living in the court for a long time when he wasn't kind of visiting Bethlehem or kind of on the run a little bit. But from this point on, they're not really going to get to see each other much. David's going to have to be out of the country, fleeing on the run. So I think they kind of realize that this is a different transition in both of their lives. Jonathan says, "Go in the assurance the two of us pledged in the name of the Lord, when we said, the Lord will be a witness between you and me and between my offspring and your offspring forever." So he reminds him of that pledge that David made, that covenant that he would deal kindly with Jonathan's children. He knows that those children will be threats to David's rule and David's kingship. So easiest thing would be to take them out. But of course, we'll see later on that David does honor this friendship and honor this covenant as in different ways with Jonathan's offspring. So that gets us to 21. So David went to the priest Ahimelech at Nob. Let me go back here. So if you look at that kind of cluster of cities right in the top middle, Gibeah is right next to number 3. So he's not run too far. He's going to run to Nob first, which is just south of there. And it appears that's where the priests and the tabernacle has been relocated. If you remember, it was at Shiloh earlier in the book, and then it seems like Shiloh might have gotten razed in battle. So it looks like that's been moved to Nob. And this man, Ahimelech, we'll see is actually a maybe great-grandson of Eli at this point. He's a descendant of Eli, which will be important here in a minute. Ahimelech was afraid to meet David, so he said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" I think he wonders what the situation is. Maybe he's heard enough about David and Saul's issues between each other. David answered the priest Ahimelech, "The king gave me a mission, but he told me, 'Don't let anyone know anything about the mission I'm sending you on or what I have ordered you to do. I have stationed my young men at a certain place. Now what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found.'" I wanted to kind of focus on this for a moment, and we've seen throughout the story, we didn't mention it in that previous chapter, but there's a lot of stories being told that are not necessarily true. Like Jonathan told Saul, "Oh, David he asked me to go to Bethlehem and be with his family." Well, we know that wasn't the plan, that wasn't true. Here we have David telling Elimelech that, "Oh, I'm here on a mission from the king." Clearly, that's not true. These are some of those interesting times we don't have in a little aside by the author or by God saying, "Oh, by the way, David lied here. That wasn't very nice of him." So there's a lot of these times where we kind of have to use our own judgment here. Is this a straight up lie by David? Maybe it's one of those kind of gray areas. Maybe is deceit always necessarily a lie, or?
I have a friend who's a member of the church. We've had lots of conversations. He believes strongly that there is such a thing as a righteous lie.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses this in that last story, and of course Rahab.
Yeah, Rahab's a good one.
He makes a decent case. I don't know the answers for it. I don't know where I land.
So,
But the thing to say something righteous.
well, define righteous lie for us, I guess. What would you?
Well, that it would not necessarily that it's a good thing, but it's definitely something God would overlook.
So you're.
Follows the thinking of the ends justifies the means in some cases.
Right, and of course it's a dangerous road to go down because it's situational and
Mm-hmm.
obviously. So we've had many conversations. He makes a great case.
Yeah.
You know, he lied. There's just no, in my mind, lied. There will be consequences. Ahimelech's going to be killed as a result of his lie. Now, how do you think David felt after his lie got another man killed? Saul's going to come kill.
Well, I would say that this lie was trying to avoid Ahimelech being killed, because Ahimelech now has plausible deniability. of David. So I think that's really, and that's why it's such a tricky one, because David is trying to keep the truth from Ahimelech. So when Ahimelech is asked by Saul, why did you help David? He can say, he doesn't have to lie then. He can say, he told me he was here on a mission from the king, and hopefully the king would spare his life then. So that's why it's one of those situational ethics, kind of conundrums here, because David is I would say he's not telling the truth, but he's got a pretty good reason. He's not doing it to deceive Ahimelech. He's doing it to try to save his life and spare his life. So that's why this is one of those interesting thought exercises. When you're trying to save someone's life in that way, does that make a lie okay or something?
Abraham tried to save Sarah, right? I mean, a similar situation standing in front of a king or a leader. And in every situation, though, to your point, there's consequences that follow, right? Like,
Yep.
David is the chosen king. He still goes and lays with Bathsheba. There's a lot of consequences that come out of that.
Sure.
But it creates the lineage by which things happen, right? Like, so there's many stories in the Bible where we can look at it and go, that wasn't the honest way to handle that. But even in those moments where man tries to control the situation, God finds the good, but holds them accountable for their wrongdoing at the same time. And I think that's the bigger story that needs to be seen.
And the key here is, again, we're not told what God's feelings are about this story, or the one with Jonathan that we mentioned, or we're not told God was happy or God was mad or whatever. We get to decide for ourselves there.
But I think we got to walk away with, look, anytime you lie, you can come up with 1,000 reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why? We just did a good thing over here. Preserved my job, kept my kids in. Boy, I think Christians, we got to look at it. There's never a time to lie. We're always to tell the truth. And if that's where it falls, if it lands us in jail, if it gets us in trouble, if it gets us killed by the Muslims, or whatever, we've got to tell the truth. I think it's expected. God hates lying.
Yeah. That's one of those tough questions. Do you take that pretty black and white line right there?
I think we have to.
It's the safest course. I would agree, definitely.
I'm going to do it. I don't know if I would take that course.
And and it's tough because you can always come up with this instance, or like the Nazis are in my house and I got 20 Jews upstairs. Do I say no? I don't have Jews upstairs. How do you do that? So, well, if you don't lie, then there are 20 Jews dead upstairs in your attic. So.
We've seen situations where where the person told the truth in a situation that there was no hope. Guess what?
Yep. So I guess the important thing to remember in those terrible instances where not lying means people are probably dying, is you need to also have some trust in the Lord to let that take care of that situation. And I think this is one of those instances where maybe David was like, oh, if I do this, maybe I can. He wasn't. I don't know. I'm just thinking, but maybe he wasn't trusting quite as much that the Lord would take care of the situation in the way he chose. He was trying to help out. He's not condemned for this, and I don't think the Lord afterward was like, hey, that was really bad. I think this is one of those things that just kind of sin, we move on. But again, thought I'd throw that fun thought exercise out for you to think about for tonight. So he's going to be. He asks for some bread for him and his men. The priest tells him there is no ordinary bread on hand. However, there is consecrated bread. But the young men may eat it only if they have kept themselves from women. David answered him, I swear that women have been kept from us, as always when I go out to battle. The young men's bodies are consecrated even on an ordinary mission, so of course their bodies are consecrated today. Who was allowed to eat this bread according to the law? The priest. But his men were starving, so what did the priest concede, I guess? Did they break the law here? Yeah. And that's why Jesus in Matthew 12 uses this exact same comparison when they were getting on to his apostles for eating bread on the Sabbath. And he says, "You guys, you're keeping the letter of the law, but you're forgetting about things like mercy. you know, you're not supposed to eat. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Well, I guess that oxen that fell in the hole should just sit there and die. That wasn't the point of the law. The law was given for good. And if there are extenuating circumstances in this instance for someone starving, but there's only consecrated bread, well, that's okay. We desire mercy more than keeping the every little part of the law, and that's what's happening here. To Ahimelech's credit, he understands enough about mercy in this instance to show that, hey, give him the bread. It's all right. It'll be fine. So the priest gave the consecrated bread, for there was no bread except the bread of the presence that had been removed from the presence of the Lord. When the bread was removed, it had been replaced by warm bread. One of Saul's servants, detained before the Lord, was there that day. His name was Doeg the Edomite. Remember his name, chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, "Do you have a spear or sword on hand? I didn't even bring my sword or my weapons, since the king's mission was urgent." So he doesn't even have a way to defend himself at this point. He fled in the middle of the night, so he's got nothing, no food, no sword at all. If you remember, just a couple chapters before, it was really only Saul and Jonathan that had swords. So it's not like swords are just all over the place and everyone's got a sword or something. Most people probably didn't have swords, so it's not like you could get one easily. But there is a sword there, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it for yourself, for there isn't another one here. So David is going to be using Goliath's sword going forward. Yes, ma'am. Let's see. I read about it, but now I can't remember out.
I mean, I'm curious. Like, if you just had some candy bread, why are we having this conversation? Where was that?
I think, they replaced it. Yeah, they replaced it regularly, and it's still, even the ones that was replaced. So you take out the old bread, you put the nice warm bread in. The old bread, I think, was still in a state of holiness. So it's not like it became common bread again and anyone could have it.
I guess to answer her question by inference is that the warm bread had already been appointed to be holy bread.
Yeah.
Like it was already holy to begin with. They just were putting the fresh loaf out.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now we have a little bit of, actually another one of David's kind of schemes, or I guess lies, kind of we talked about here. He flees to Achish, King Achish of Gath, which is interesting. We just talked about the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. Where was Goliath from? Gath. So he's kind of brave to be heading. This is the situation with David. He feels safer going to Gath than staying in Israel where Saul is. So he flees to King Achish of Gath, who he knows who David is. Isn't this David? Interesting, the king of the land. He's heard enough of David and his leadership that he assumes he's king at this point. He knows this song that they sang about after the killing of Goliath and all of David's victories. So David hears about this, and he becomes afraid of King Achish. I assume he just thought he could sneak in. I mean, all these people looked alike. I'm sure he could speak Philistine, or they all spoke, similar dialect. He could probably hide. He thought he could hide in the court there, and no one would notice. He's just another member of the court. But the king recognizes him. So what does he do? He pretends to be insane in their presence. He acts like a madman, scribbling on the doors, the city gate, letting spit, saliva run down his beard. And then Achish, I love this. You see this man is crazy. Why did you bring him to me? Do I have such a shortage of crazy people that you brought this one to act crazy around me? And do I have so few crazy people that I needed another one here? Is this going to come in my house? He's like, get this guy out of here. Why is he around? He doesn't even just get him out of here. So David leaves Gath, takes refuge in the cave of Adullam. When David's brothers and his father's whole family heard, they went down and joined him there. And in addition, every man who was desperate, in debt, or discontented rallied around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men. So he actually, seems like he's been alone for the past couple verses. He left Ahimelech and Nob. He goes to Achish. He's alone there. He doesn't have anyone with him, but now he's going to have some people with him. His family's going to join him. He's going to start to kind of assemble a little bit of a rabble-rousing mob here. And he actually flees all the way to Moab with his family. So the situation is getting to the point where the family is under threat as well. So he's getting them all out of there, his mother, his father, his brothers, and he leaves them all the way in Moab, what's David's connection with Moab?
He's descendant of Ruth, who was a Moabite woman.
So he's got some connections with Moab, maybe. I don't know what interaction he would have had with family over there or with Ruth's family, but I don't know how well known the story of Ruth was at this point, but he's safe in Moab and his family is safe in Moab. But the prophet says, don't stay in the stronghold, leave and return to the land of Judah. So he can't stay there forever. He needs to go back to the land of Judah. Now Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. At that time Saul was in Gibeah, sitting under the tamarisk tree at the high place. His spear was in his hand. All his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants, listen, men of Benjamin, is Jesse's son going to give you all fields and vineyards? Do you think he'll make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? That's why all of you have conspired against me. Nobody tells me when my own son makes a covenant with Jesse's son. None of you cares about me or tells me that my son has stirred up my own servant to wait in ambush for me, as is the case. So here's Saul again. He's getting up and he's mad at his whole court now because they're keeping things from him. Why did no one tell me that Jonathan had made a covenant with David? Do you guys support David? Is he going to give you all the things that I've given you? Fields and vineyards and everything. Is he going to make you commanders of hundreds? He's at this point, just the leader of a gang of ruffians at this point. And nobody's told me anything. Why haven't you guys? You can just see this kind of mad king kind of situation happening. And then here's this guy Doeg, verse 9. Doeg the Edomite, who was in charge of Saul's servants, answered, I saw Jesse's son come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions. He also gave him the sword of Goliath. So Doeg was there. He tells on Ahimelech. And remember, Gibeah is not too far, so he summons Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, to him, probably maybe an hour, 30-minute walk or something. Didn't seem like that far. He summons Ahimelech and his father's whole family, who were priests in Nob. So Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, I guess is the priest now, but his whole family, all brothers-in-law, they're all priests. And they all came to the king, and Saul said, listen, son of Ahitub, I'm at your service, my lord, he said. Saul asked, why did you and Jesse's son conspire against me? You gave him bread and a sword and inquired of God for him, so he could rise up against me and wait in ambush, as in the case today. And Ahimelech, remember, he kind of has plausible deniability here. He said, David came. He doesn't know about everything that's happening. He's like, who is as faithful as David? He is the king's son-in-law. He's captain of your bodyguard. He's honored in your house. Was today the first time I've inquired of the Lord for him? I mean, David clearly has been there before. He's inquired of the Lord for him before, and it was fine then. Of course not. Please don't let the king make an accusation against your servant or any of my father's family, for your servant didn't have any idea about this. And he's right. He didn't. It seemed like he didn't have any idea about this. For all he knew, David was a trusted servant of Saul. But here's Saul. His anger, his mind is completely warped. You will die, Ahimelech, you and your father's whole family. And he turns around. He orders the guards standing by him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they sided with David, for they knew he was fleeing, but they didn't tell me. But the king's servants would not lift a hand to execute the priests of the Lord. Remember before, he ordered his servants to kill Jonathan, and they protected him, they redeemed him, they wouldn't let him kill Jonathan. Well, now the servants are not going to kill the priests. But there's Doeg. He's not an Israelite, he's an Edomite. Go and execute the priests, he says. So Doeg and the Edomite went and executed the priests himself. On that day he killed 85 men who wore linen ephods. He also struck down Moab. So he didn't just, remember, the priests had traveled to where Saul was to visit him. He kills the priests there. Then Doeg goes and strikes down the city where they lived. And this phrase is really interesting. We've seen this almost exact phrase before. So Doeg, he goes to Nob in verse 19, and he struck the city of the priests with the sword, both men and women, infants and nursing babes, oxen, donkeys, and sheep. Where have we seen that phrase before?
That's what Saul was told to do to the Amalekites.
The Amalekites. He was told to go to the Amalekites, that wicked people. There was a reason for it, because they had attacked the Israelites way back in the day. They were a wicked Canaanite people. He was told to go and strike them down completely. Men and women, infants and nursing babes, oxen, donkeys, sheep, and I think it says camels back then. That's the only difference. So Saul is not willing to do that to a wicked nation like the Amalekites, and yet here he is more than willing to destroy a city of priests to the Lord, of his own people, full of women and children. He kills them all. It's just mind-blowing when you think about that. What's happened to Saul over the course of this narrative. And remember, we said that Ahimelech was a descendant of Eli. What was the prophecy against Eli way back at the beginning of 1 Samuel? Priesthood would be taken from him, and what about his family? There would be, there would no longer be any old people. They wouldn't last long enough to be old anymore in his family. Like Eli, he made it to 98 years old. Well, they wouldn't last long enough because most of them would die a early or violent death, and that's exactly what happens here, to the point where his family is completely decimated except for one man that survived, Abiathar. And he ends up fleeing to David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Verse 22, then David said to Abiathar, I knew that Doeg the Edomite was there that day, and that he was sure to report to Saul. I myself am responsible for the lives of everyone in your father's family. Stay with me, don't be afraid. For the one who wants to take my life wants to take your life. You'll be safe with me. So, I can't even imagine what David would feel when he hears this news, and he blames himself. Obviously, he's not truly the one at fault, but he knows that because of him visiting there and being there, that he brought death on not just one man, but an entire family of people. And then Abiathar will follow David the rest of his kind of campaign, and eventually become priest for David down the road as well. So that takes us to, let's see, we finished chapter 22, so we'll look at chapter 23. We'll probably do a couple chapters again on Sunday. 23, we might even do 4 chapters because 24 and 26 are kind of parallel stories. But we're in this situation now where David is on the run. So he's going to be fleeing from Saul for almost the rest of the entire book. All right, thank you so much.
Good evening. It's good to be here with you tonight. I have really just one question I'd like for us to consider this evening. The question is, how real is heaven to you? I ask that question because I was reading a commentary, I think it was Kyle and Delich, and they were talking about acknowledging the presence of God. That if we had a constant understanding that we live in the presence of God every day, that God is everywhere and God sees everything we do, if we had that constant knowledge of being in God's presence, it would make sinning extraordinarily hard. After all, if you realize that God is in front of you all the time, you're not going to want to sin in God's presence. I'm reminded of we call it the chapter of faith, Hebrews chapter 11, where we read about men like Abel, men like Enoch, men like Noah, men like Abraham. And in verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, all these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Verse 14. If you have a pen, I want you to underline it in your Bible. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. For this reason, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. to the people that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11, heaven was so real that they spent their lives journeying towards it. They didn't want to settle for a fancy city. They didn't want to settle in the palaces of Egypt, in Pharaoh's courts. They didn't want to settle in the halls of Rome. They didn't want to have all the fancy things that we have today. They wanted something better. They wanted heaven. And they endured so much in their lives because of that confession, because they knew heaven was real, because they had trusted in the promises of God. They were willing to endure incredible hardships. And I love this description of them. In verse 38, they are described as men of whom the world was not worthy. Wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. I think if there's anything you could put on a Christian's headstone, I can think of no greater compliment than that. Men of whom the world was not worthy. You see, all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Heaven was real to them, and it changed every decision that they made in their lives. So I want to ask you again, how real is heaven to you? If heaven is real to you, it will change the choices that you make, the ways that you choose to spend your time. If heaven is real to you, then suddenly certain things just don't seem important anymore, right? Television shows, social media, whatever it is, how you spend your time, you start looking at it through a different lens, and you realize that your choices either bring you closer to God or take you further away. The things that you choose to invest your time in start to look a little different. You stop caring so much about appointments. You start caring a whole lot more about people. The Hebrew writer puts it this way in chapter 12 and verse 1. For this reason, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. If you're here tonight and we can help you to lay aside the sin that so easily entangles us, won't you please come forward while we stand and while we sing?
Come weep and love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus around the throne, and thus around the throne. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Let those refuse to sing who never knew our God, but children of the heavenly King, but children of the heavenly King, may speak their joys abroad, may speak their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Then let our songs abound and every tear be dry. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. To bear worlds on high, to bear worlds on high. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God.
It's good to see each and every one out tonight. Appreciate so much your presence. On our sick and shut-in list, Brother Richard Waddell let me know that Sister Becky's going in tomorrow for some additional tests. So let's remember Becky in our prayers. Also continue to remember Sister Faith Spence and Sister Barb Wilkinson and those that are shut in. Sister Nichols, Sister Barry, Sister Alexander, Sister Atherton, and also the Weinbrenners. The only other announcement I have is this Sunday, Brother Marty Gailey will be speaking to us on Sunday morning, and Brother Chris Benson on Sunday night. This time we'll be dismissing our prayer by Brother Alan Brown.
Let's pray. Dear God, we're so grateful to come to you tonight. We ask for any sins that may be on our account to be forgiven. God, help us to keep our eyes on heaven. Help us to look at the world through that lens. Help us to care more about the people around us and see the souls in need. God, we're so grateful for the group that worships here. We ask that you be with all the families represented here, all the things that we go through in this life. Help those, especially that are sick and struggling, that those that are attending to them will bring them back to a better portion of health. God, we ask that you continue to be with this group as we search for a new minister to preach here in this location. Please be with the elders as they lead the group and lead that search. Just help us to all grow closer to you and look forward to that home in heaven